Why are you here? Most probably, one of the reasons is because Ofsted are soon going to come knocking at the door wanting to know how good your curriculum is. And that means going beyond GCSE results and looking at what's behind each lesson. Is there a coherent plan? Are the lessons connected? Is there a kind of narrative that goes all the way up to the bigger goals and how that determines what the topics are? And each lesson should have some kind of line of sight all the way to what you want to achieve long term. The good news is that the kind of curriculum they're looking for is precisely the same as what you need to equip students for the new GCSE, which is about, more than anything, thinking with what you know, not just remembering a lot of stuff. And we know how difficult that is. You only have to look at last year's Carrotgate incident, where students were completely flummoxed by a small change in a typical question. So AQA told us that all they'd done was replace the word potato with carrot pretty much in the standard experiment, and then students couldn't do it. And in fact, they complained that they hadn't been taught about carrots. If you've done some of the reading, you know that that's called fragile knowledge. That's the kind of knowledge that will get you from, let's say, from the center of town to your hotel if somebody gives you directions, but outside that you don't know what to do. And that's really not good enough for new GCSE. Obviously, that's always been the case with physics. People don't know which equation to use. And again, if you've done the reading, what we presented was some analysis of what's actually involved in doing a really difficult question. And this one was difficult for me, being a physicist. It demands a lot of concepts and the ability to know which one to use and how to connect things into an explanation. And we described some theory in the reading that sheds light on what we've actually got to do to typical students to make them able to solve these problems. And the body of research that's really relevant here is comparing novices and experts. And the way we looked at it was to say that novices actually can know quite a lot. They can cram, of course. They can have lots of facts, but just like picking one book out of a huge stack when they're disorganized, it's really difficult to solve problems if your knowledge is in a mess. Experts, and the analogy is like finding a book in a library, they have organized knowledge. Often it's in the kind of hierarchical form, but what it means is that when it's connected around bigger ideas, these fundamental principles, that means that an expert can detect what is going on underneath that apparently new situation. It's actually a familiar principle, and they can then kind of regurgitate all the knowledge they need to solve it. So really what we're aiming for is knowledge, of course, but organized around these big ideas. So what's different, and you may have seen this slide because we've been going on about this for about a couple of years, is that the specification is not it's not your curriculum. The specification is there as a checklist to make sure everything is covered and what tells you what the examiners can theoretically ask, but unfortunately it doesn't give you the flavor of what you should teach. It's only telling you what's in AO1, and as 60% is if you like dark matter, what's not in those statements, that means you've got to construct the curriculum. You've got to design it and use the specification, of course, but only as a guide to what should be covered. Now, the whole idea of what we're doing with our 5-year plan can be condensed into 2 words, which is curriculum and alignment. Lining up everything towards the bigger aim. So if you look at this diagram, a typical syllabus or a specification seems to be the basis of a lot of curricula, and that will get you through to AO1, no problem. But it may not prepare students terribly well for AO2 and AO3 if they haven't had enough chance to learn to think. So what we're suggesting is that if you align all the elements of a curriculum with the actual goal, which is AO2 and AO3 as much as AO1, then that's likely to produce better results. And more significantly, in the long term, that's the kind of student you want to create if they're going to go on to study science at a higher level, or if they're not, to be able to do something with what they've learned instead of forget all of it after 10 years of study. If you actually use this 5-year plan, it has some quite big payoffs. I've been talking to many teachers in our face-to-face sessions, and they really like this map. This comes directly out of our database, so you may not be able to read it all, but let me explain it to you. So let's say you've been using the 5-year plan and you've been teaching these key concepts through the years, and you've been using the assessment that's aligned with the knowledge that we've set out. What you've done is you've made a judgment for each class as to whether they've mastered or not each key concept along the way. And what that means is when you get to year 9 or year 10, you don't have to reteach everything starting from 0. And also, you don't have to make the unwise decision of assuming they've learned everything from previous years and then start afresh on the new stuff. Neither of those is probably valid. But if you've been following these key concepts and assessing them on the way up, and you've made these judgments, then you can go, well, I'm teaching Newton's second law now. I can see what the prior concepts are that students really need to have understood in previous years. And I can see how they did with each of those. So I know that they got a lot of what was in year 7 and some of what was in year 8, but then things went wrong, and I'm going to have to take a few steps back and probe in a bit more detail as to what they know about speed and acceleration. Because if they don't get acceleration, there's obviously no way they're going to put that together into Newton's laws. So you can really adapt the teaching more as you go up the years if you've got this key concept framework in place, because in a way topics are now no longer the currency. Really what we're talking about are key concepts and organizing them into a progression, and that's where to go. So the other benefit is that if you are using our objectives in the 5-year plan, which are all categorized as AO1, 2, and 3, then you assess those and you can get a kind of ongoing progress measure for each of those throughout your terms and years and see if students are developing. At the beginning, you might expect they're doing quite well with AO1, but not so well with AO2 and AO3. But over time, as they learn those strategies to apply and analyze with knowledge, and you're teaching in more depth, you'd expect those to improve. And that's the kind of indication that would tell you that students might do well at GCSE. And in fact, I would argue it might be more predictive than just doing tests and taking percentages. So that's kind of the overview. And what we're going to cover in the rest of the session are the elements. We'll go through how to align the goals, the outcomes, learning objectives, whatever you call them, with AO1 to AO3. And then we'll look at how you might assess that so you can track the progress as I've just showed you. And then finally, of course, how does teaching itself need to shift if it's going to go deeper and further? At the end of every section, we're going to stop and pause so that you're going to have the chance to ask questions. What we'd like you to do is put any questions you've got in the chat. As we teach, going through it all, you can ask anything or put any thoughts you have, and we'll answer them at the end of that section. I won't probably stop now unless there are any burning questions that have already been asked, and we'll go straight into the first one.
We have got one, Tony, that maybe you could answer from Connor.
Go ahead.
What is the threshold for moving on in terms of mastery? Is there a percentage, 70%, 80%, 90% of students understanding? What would you say?
Okay, so there are lots of different views on this. In the traditional mastery literature, they reckoned 80% was a good threshold. Of course, it depends on how difficult the questions are. So in the scheme that we've written, acquire questions, you could definitely set that as a threshold, but some of the apply questions are much harder and you wouldn't have such a high threshold for that. I think that's really a case of judgment. And the reason to set the threshold high, I think that's the main point, not so much exactly what the value is. The reason to set it high is because memory theory suggests that the higher the storage strength that you learn something, the easier it will be to relearn it later. So you're going to come back to all these topics in a more complicated form later that you might teach in year 7. And if they half mastered it, then you might as well start again because they won't remember very much. Whereas if they really did get it and they've got 80% on a test, then the fact is they'll actually learn it really quickly. They will have forgotten some of it, but it will come back quite easily. That's what the research says. So that's really the reason to set the threshold high, and then it's a matter of judgment.
Okay, thank you.
So the first area of the curriculum to align are the goals. And we've created this 5-year plan. We thought it would take a year, but it's probably going to take us 5 years to finish it because it keeps getting better and we have feedback on things that we haven't put in. The idea is that we've got this progression, a big picture of what's really important to understand behind everything. And then we work downwards and tell you what could you put in each unit and how to make acquire, apply and analyze objectives for every single key concept. And the other part of it that's important is not writing objectives as like, learn this, understand that. That is the knowledge, of course. Unfortunately, that doesn't really tell you much about what to do with it. So a lot of educators now think that writing things as a performance, that means what do I do with that understanding? That makes it easy to know whether they've understood. So this is the 5-year plan. And as I said, it will be published soon, year by year. It began by reverse engineering the secondary science GCSE and trying to figure out what were the big ideas. This list is pretty much in agreement with many educators' attempts to define what were the fundamental principles in science. They call them different names, but it's the same thing, of course. And then we went one further level down, which was a bit new. And we tried to identify all the key concepts. These are the things to spend time on in every unit. And most of the time we recommend should be on these. In other words, focusing on the understanding of each one of these, because it's more, if you like, generative, more fruitful when it comes to applying this understanding than it is to collect lots of facts. So having got them, we just arranged them into a sensible order, and lots of people have looked at it and we've changed it around, and there's nothing to stop you changing that order around. Sometimes it would be silly to move things because clearly you need to know about speed and acceleration before you can understand Newton's second law. And likewise, it makes sense early on with the forces and fields idea that you introduce weight and gravity and you introduce magnetism, possibly at different times. And then later on, you show the interconnections between them and generalize this idea of fields. So there is definitely progression, but you may have an alternative way of setting it out. We also go straight into the detail for each key concept and try and create, if you like, this schema, this mental model that we want students to have in their mind, centered around a big idea. So if this is cell structure, we identified that there were probably two ideas really, one to do with cells as building blocks and the other that cells have particular functions. So we separated those so that we could teach each one individually and give it its proper time. And we connected them with the relevant concepts and facts that are in the national curriculum. So they all get their kind of time allocation, but the point is to prioritize the green ideas at the center. So they're the ones that are understood. And what's in common to all of these is that they're the explanations that students need to understand if they're going to apply them to unfamiliar situations. You can also see that we've got a kind of triplet, a three-dimensional set of objectives. So one dimension is the science idea, of course. Then there's the inquiry process. So models, arguing, explaining, doing maths. That's the second dimension, which can get ignored, but really has to be there because a lot of the apply and analyze questions have loads of inquiry implicit in them, and you can't really get beyond if you don't understand how to hypothesize, model, explain, and argue. You can't write these explanations. There's also a third area, which ironically is about that much in the GCSE trilogy specification. They call that big ideas, and it's things like cause and effect, structure and function, systems, scale and proportionality. In fact, these are fundamental ways that scientists think, and because they're off the radar very often, students never learn them. So we're trying to make them explicit so that you can then put them into your lessons and go, by the way, this is a system. A system has parts, they have functions, they connect. And knowing that gives you students some kind of underlying ideas that can really boost their understanding. So that's the knowledge framework for each key concept, and that would allow you to plan your assessment and teaching to make sure everything there was covered. And that's the end of that section. So I'm going to stop and see if you've got some questions.
Just having a look. Had a lot of conversation on the chat, which is really good. I think Connor has asked a question, and Gary is chatting with him about it, but he asked, can this be imported wholesale into a school science programme, or would extensive teacher training be required? I don't know if we've got any anything we can say about schools that are already doing this, what they've done.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, any change that's quite substantial like this is going to require some professional development. So we found that there were a few things that were quite difficult to get your head round. And we have some schools who are using the plan with the materials we've created, and schools that are using the plan with their own materials. I think there are a lot of things that are new, and in particular, this idea of using assessment in an adaptive way is difficult. We'll come to that soon. The idea of spending adequate time on a key concept and not just rushing through it with a lesson plan that kind of rumps through everything, as let's say if you're following a publisher scheme that would do. And we have some schools who basically say, why haven't we got enough material from you? We're getting through it too fast, which is kind of a warning light that, you know, they're maybe not spending enough time developing the students' ideas. So I suspect that we got conditioned into teaching too fast and not going into enough depth. So yes, there definitely are some needs for CPD. What do you think, Gemma?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, I think in order to incorporate everything that we're saying today, it's quite a big change to a curriculum. So Kamal just said a question, I think, about, you know, can you use this as a current scheme of work, you know, looking at how many changes we have to make.
Absolutely. I think you absolutely can if you know what you're doing. So I hate to say this, but, you know, teaching is one really hard job. Curriculum design is a different job. and the overlap is not so great. So, I've been doing the curriculum design bit for more than 20 years, and I would be absolutely hopeless at the teaching bit. They don't really cross over, and we've had writers who take a long time to learn how to do the writing. So I think you need some expertise in doing the adaptation, is what I'm saying. And you can certainly get your head around it, but you'd have to put some time into it. And it does seem a bit of a load for departments to throw at teachers to say, well, rewrite the schemes, because there's some expertise involved in doing that. And it's not easy for us, so it wouldn't be easy for people who are trying to do it on their weekend. But you can do it. I would suggest, you do it bit by bit. You take a topic, and we're going to give you a topic that we've created at the end of this. So it might be good if you use that, deconstruct it, talk about it with your department, and then think, well, can we do this ourselves? It's essentially the same decision I always make with DIY versus picking up the phone and calling in an expert to fix the problem in my house.
Yep. No, I think, so I say a lot of good chat. People ask if we've got exemplar material. So obviously, you just said that is everyone here will be given a sample topic. So if you want to see if it works in your school, it's a good opportunity to use that with Year 7 in September. So I think that's it for now.
Yeah, so I mean, we do have a dual role here. We obviously are producing materials and we sell them, but we're kind of a relatively benign organization here, because as much as possible we try to get funding to produce these things free, hence the 5-year plan, because it's sponsored, and there'll be lots of materials that we do get sponsored to create, let's say like Update, to do the more problem solving things, which will be free. So I hope you'll take advantage of the ones that are all free. Okay, let's move on to assessment. Now, we are trying basically to match assessment up with the goal of AO3 and AO2 and going beyond recall. And we can do that in two ways. We can do that with the summative assessment, and we can do that with some formative or diagnostic assessment along the way. Let's have a look at the summative first. So here's one we wrote earlier, and you're going to get this in your Dropbox. I hope that will be tomorrow. This is a prototype of a test. We have done tests for the materials we've created, and based on the feedback, this is the version 2 that's being published now. And what that does is make it look more like a kind of training exam paper. And you could create this yourself. Certainly it would take a while, but here's what to do if you want to. What you need is essentially to simulate the whole GCSE in miniature. So GCSE is trying to say 40% AO1, 40% AO2, 20% AO3, about 40% scientific inquiry, about 15% maths. You can represent all of those within a 15-mark test. And here's how you do it. So you start with question 1 and question 2. These are recall, what the exam board's called knowledge in isolation. Just facts, really. Then you move on to understanding, still AO1, but you've got to get an understanding of the concept in. And you can sneak in a question that's to do with inquiry, because you're going to need a few of those in there. And as I say, you'll get this in the Dropbox, so you can study it and see if it's a model you want to use. And then you move on to apply and analyze, and here's the end of the test. So an analyze question would be hopefully an appropriate language version of the sort of thing you get at GCSE. And what defines it as analyze is A, that you've got some information you need to interpret, and B, that the students have to go beyond that information and make some sort of judgment or inference or evaluate something or improve it. And So we've constructed these questions, and you can find some of them probably on test-based, but they'll likely need to be adapted. So a summative assessment like that, which had 15 marks, would allow you to build up a profile for each student and the class based on AOs. And if you listen to AQA, they will tell you this is a very good idea to do, because this is going to tell you whether you're on track. It's kind of getting at the cognitive processes behind AO2 and AO3, which, if you just photocopy lots of old exam papers, especially in year 8 and year 7, wouldn't really do that. So in principle, you can construct a replica of a GCSE aligned test. And if that's where you're heading to, that gives you a fairly clear goal of what you've got to teach along the way. Now, we're a big fan, of course, of formative assessment. And let's say you're trying to teach this key concept in year 7 of weight. You've done some pre-assessment to see if they understood anything from primary school, and you've spent a long time trying to teach this relationship between mass and weight. And Gemma's going to explain how you could do that in a way that's going to be aligned in a minute. And then you come to the assessment. And here's how you could use your AO2, AO3 thinking to put together some formative assessment that will tell you if students have a strong enough idea of the weight concept that they're likely to be able to apply it. And what we're really looking for is kind of accuracy, whether they've got a good grasp of the individual parts of that understanding, and also whether they've got no really faulty understanding, which we've called misconceptions there. So we've listed these facets, these aspects of the understanding we want, and we've listed the things that we don't want down the left. And the way to construct an aligned assessment, a formative one, would be to then say, okay, so let's come up with a number of situations to turn into questions, and let's map those against what facets and misconceptions they address. And you end up with a kind of tick grid. And you want to try and fill it with as many ticks as you can, because the more you can do, the more reliable your assessment's going to be. So here we've got kind of a minimum really of 6 questions to test that one idea. And we're going to look at one of them. Now, they're actually going to be multiple choice questions. You don't have to use multiple choice, but it has so many advantages for this kind of thing, because it's quick, you can assess a lot, and it's easy to mark. And if it's well written, it can certainly find out if they've got some faulty ideas. So here's the question. You can read that. So 2 identical rockets. And why is there a different takeoff thrust on the moon? I hope not too many physicists here, because they tend to argue about whether there's some inconsistency in this question. But that aside, look at it from the point of view of what's it trying to show you. So what we do is we come up with a situation that will allow us to say, okay, if students really understood it, they would realize B, that it's to do with gravity. On the other hand, if they partially understand it, or they're tempted by a misconception that students often have, then they're likely to plump for A and C. And because of that, guessing is less important, because they're likely to go for the wrong answer if they didn't really understand. And you have 6 of these. You can do them very fast. And then when students mark them themselves, what's really important is that they start self-reflecting, and you're teaching them to be in charge of what they're learning. So they look at the correct answer if they got it wrong, but they also look at why the wrong answer they put was wrong. And this starts them thinking about what they've got to do to repair their understanding. So this is diagnostic assessment, and this is kind of an essential element to getting this right schema in their heads. So that's really what I wanted to say about using assessment and aligning it. So as you can see, that's kind of aligned directly with AO1 and AO2. We've got some apply questions in there with the calculations, and we've got some good AO1 stuff. That's probably enough to do for formative assessment, because if that's strong, then you know that they can understand it well enough that you could move on to new situations, as Gemma will show you, an analysis after. So I think it's putting in a really good bedrock. Gemma, questions?
I'm just having a look. Not many questions about assessment at the moment, just about the fact that in the test that you showed, there's only 3 marks for analysis. Is that enough marks, to give a valid percentage of how well those students are doing in the AO3?
Quite right. It probably is not. But if you do enough of them, you'll get a better idea. It's really a trade-off. If you want more of that, then it's going to be a longer test. And as it is, it's at least 20 minutes. And this is for one concept, remember, which is just over a week's teaching. So you're going to be doing these quite often. You could put them together, of course, and do them over a term. I think it's time to move on to your section here and go into aligned teaching.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm going to be having a look at the teaching and learning stages that we're using to teach these concepts. So I'm going to go through each of these stages really quickly, that you can see on the screen now. And I'm going to start off using the key concept of weight to do that. So this is the schema similar to the one Tony showed you earlier with the cell structure. This is how we set it out in blueprints. We've got the clearly defined knowledge that the students need to understand here. And the first stage that we do is called Activate. And we set students a pre-assessment task in Activate. So in this example here, we're looking at gravity. Now, gravity is something that students accumulate a lot of knowledge about in their everyday life. The problem is this could either help or it could hinder the teaching of weight, or understanding that concept of weight. So before we teach the concept, we need to probe what they already understand. So what we've done in this pre-assessment is we've chosen 2 situations that will expose if their ideas are consistent with what we're about to teach them. So in the first case there, a lot of students have the idea that gravity always acts downwards. So rather than it being an attractive force towards the centre of the earth. So if they have that idea, then the students are going to draw the yo-yos all going down. So we'll be able to expose that they've got that idea. The second situation, they might believe that motion is a result of a single force. And so they might then reason that if the tree is falling down the slope, or it can fall down the slope, then gravity must be acting along the slope. And they wouldn't again realise that gravity is acting towards the centre of the earth. So once you've done this pre-assessment with your students and you can see what they've actually done, you can go for a rethink. So in the rethink, you are going to have a look at what these existing ideas the students have got and correct them before you carry on to teach the new concept. So in this example here is what we said before, the student is thinking that gravity acts downwards. So you need to question their ideas. So if you said to them, okay, well, what happened if you turn the globe up the other way round? What will happen to the person now standing on top? They begin to realise that their idea is not correct and start to change it. Okay. So that's the Activate stage. And now we can go on to the Acquire stage, where the students are going to learn the new concept. Now, this is what typically happens in a scheme of work. So this is a lesson on gravity. So basically, the teacher tells them the concept, and then they do an activity to confirm that weight-mass relationship, and then they practice using the equation. Now, the problem is that students aren't going to get a good understanding this way. If you've just told them what the equation is, they haven't built up an understanding about that, and they haven't had much time to think about it. So we do things a little differently. we've taken a different approach for this, and it's based on many lines of research. And so the research suggests that there is good evidence that a particular form of inquiry called model-based inquiry is more effective than just telling them direct instruction. And it's where when students begin to build models to explain that phenomenon. And it's not discovery learning. We're not saying, let your children just do what they want and try and discover it. It's very much guided and scaffolded so they come to the right answers. So this is our version of this lesson here. So we're putting it in an interesting context, first of all, which is also really important. And we're going to get students to imagine that they're taking this fixed mass on an imaginary journey around the solar system, and they're going to weigh it at different places. So they're going to be doing a practical activity where they have this mass and they're going to weigh it at different stations around the classroom on these different planets. So the first part of this is looking at contrasting cases. So one thing is going to vary. In this case, it's the planet, and the other things are going to remain constant. So in this case, it's the mass. It's always 1 kilogram. So this makes it easy for the student to notice what's changing and to see a pattern. So then when they can see that pattern, we're going to bring in a new quantity. They're going to express the strength of the gravity. And so this is where students are going to use their maths. They're going to see that there's a ratio there of weight to mass. So now that instead of telling them what the equation is, they're on their way to understanding what it is. They've figured it out themselves. So the key features of an explore then is up there. So we're trying to connect the existing knowledge that they've already had to new knowledge. We're helping to see the deep features and not the superficial understanding. And we're going to make them aware of knowledge gaps that they may have that they need to fill. And the second part of the explore is very important, and it's the explain part. So this is where the teacher does take part in some direct instruction. So there's going to still be some knowledge gaps after the explore. It's not going to teach them everything they need to know about this concept. So in the explain stage, the teacher builds on these students' ideas. They present the things that are going to fill the gaps, and they put their ideas into this theoretical framework. So this is where we're going to give them the equation. Okay, so that's the acquire stage. So if we go on to next is the apply stage. So often schemes of work stop after they've acquired knowledge. So students will learn a lot of facts, and then they will move on to the next stage, and then they'll move on to the next stage, learn some more facts, and at the end you're going to have a test. And most of your students are going to do really well on AO1, so they can recall, they can remember facts. But some are going to struggle with the AO2, which is the application. So you might recognise that in your own students. They're doing really well on the recall questions, but the applied questions, they're finding it a bit more difficult. So one task we're trying to do is we're trying to look at how we can help students apply questions, improve their AO2 scores. So this is where we put in this section apply after the acquire and before we assess. Sorry, I'm not moving along the slides. I've just realised, sorry. Okay, so this is what we're doing with the apply. So these are our practice books, but they're based on, well, they're kind of versions of SATs questions. So they, you could write these kind of questions yourself. So what we found that research has shown that the problem we have here is limited working memory for students. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down this question, and we're going to teach them strategies of how to solve the problem and limit that problem of the working memory. So we've got a strategy that we use called detect, recall and solve, and it simplifies how to answer these difficult questions. So the first stage is detect, and this students are going to work out what is the concept that this question is asking them about, first of all. So in this detect, they figured out that this question is about weight. The next stage is recall. So once they've recognised what the key concept is, they're going to unpack all the principles, the concepts, the facts, everything they know about the key concept, and they're going to write all these down on a piece of paper. And we've organised, this is the worked example where we've organised this into individual points. So it's one piece of knowledge at a time, unpicking it. And also we encourage students to write any diagrams, because the diagrams are a lot easier to access than just pieces of information. And the last section here we've got is the solve, and this models a pattern for producing the answers, so logically connected answers. So this is a calculation. So we're using what we call a problem solution frame. We're looking at the problem and then we're working through what the solution is. And some applied questions are going to be more about writing explanations. So we use a different frame for that one, which is called claim, evidence and reasoning. Okay, and what we have then is we have your turn questions where the students will practice the applied question, a slightly different one. This one, the first one, is very similar to the worked example. So basically they're just going back and copying the steps that they've done on the worked example. And then the questions get gradually more difficult. So we're making tiny little changes to the question and helping them to apply to more unfamiliar types of questions. Okay, that is it. And I am sorry about the bit in the middle. If anyone wants me to go through any of the other slides that I kind of skipped over. Is any questions?
I think I've been trying to keep up with some of the chatty questions here. So I don't know if there's anything specific. I think there's probably a few people who didn't quite catch on to the apply. Essentially, we are giving lots of practice with unfamiliar situations, and we're teaching a strategy to solve them, these 3-stage worked examples, modeling that and then handing over to the student. So in fact, we've broken down AO1, 2 and 3 into 3 stages of learning. You spend time on the acquire, AO1, you then go to the apply, AO2, and do some practice on that, and then you spend actual time doing AO3 analyze type tasks. So that's kind of the alignment of the teaching. I'm going to flip on to the last section here because we're really now at the end of what we said would be the time. So let's do that. And if you have any questions, Gemma can try and answer them on the chat, or we'll have another minute at the end, or we'll do it afterwards. So I wanted to say what we're going to do for you after this. My main goal really is, if you haven't looked at the 5-year plan, that is the place to start, because that's really the way to align your objectives and give you a structure for teaching units that would fit with the ultimate goal of AO2 and AO3 at GCSE. Then if you want to, we'll be sending out the Dropbox link for all the materials for one topic, and that will give you a much clearer idea than we can of what it means and how that looks different. And often it isn't dramatically different, but the way the activity is set up and what we've got students to think about and where we've guided them, that's what makes the difference. So actually there's no need to sort of come up with completely novel experiments, for instance. And also because we are kind of promoting the practice book, if you want to take advantage of that offer, please do. That's about it from us. Do we have any questions that we can answer right at the end, Gemma?
No, I kind of got a bit lost now because I'm not keeping up with it.
I know what I'm going to do, which is to reply to people just as soon as the chat ends. If we haven't answered your questions in this session, I'll email you with some answers afterwards, so you don't have to stay attached. I think that's probably a good place to stop, because I know you probably are desperate for something to do beyond the webinar, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. What we also said was that we reckon that we're throwing stuff at you that's way too much for one session. So we're going to do a repeat, and we may do a follow-up session if you'd like that. It does look like some people would. So we'll put out a survey that says, what would you like next? And we'll gladly do that in September. Until then, have a good holiday. And I'll say goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.